my son was 6 years old, he and I were trapped together in Chicago airport for many hours, and in a moment of desperation I took him to the bookshop and said, buy anything. And what he chose was the 5-volume box set of Captain Underpants, which worked perfectly. So my question to you is, what do you read to the children in your lives? Do you read Captain Underpants, Harry Potter, Henry Lawson? Probably not, frankly. Whatever you read, the national curriculum since 2008 has decided for you that your children, once they're at school, must read Australian literature. Australian literature is compulsory. And this is our object of study. What texts get chosen in the Australian literature curriculum, and why do they get chosen? What do our kids bring away from their compulsory study of Australian literature? And assuming there's, some usefulness in that, how can we help teachers to use or get the best resources to teach Australian literature in our schools? Now you might be asking, why does it matter? And I want to say to you that word that is used by every discipline now, narrative. It belongs to literary studies. These are the stories. Australian literature is the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are, what we do, where we belong, who belongs in, who belongs out. Some of this has come up already. These are the stories that circulate in our country. If we think that maybe Australian literature is compulsory because it's supposed to develop a national culture, a national identity, then the question of what gets set, why and how is absolutely vital to Australia. So we've been talking to teachers, running surveys and questionnaires to look at exactly some of those questions. And in a survey a couple of years ago, we started with that question, why? How do you choose the texts that you choose? What are you looking for? And the answer we surveyed teachers around Australia, particularly teaching secondary around years 8 to 10. The answer to that question, why, was they look for texts that their students can identify with. So, they have some point of identification. And I want you to keep that in mind when I tell you about the top 10 list. So we looked at the texts that were most set across the country from this reasonably small survey. And on the top 10 list, the top one was Jasper Jones there, which was set 16 separate instances. So in that top 10 list, there were about 5 things in common. One was most of them were by men. 7 out of 10 by men. Most of them were by white men, 6 out of 10 by white men, including Jasper Jones here, which is a story about Indigenous relations in a country town, Indigenous white relations in a country town in Australia. All of them were written published between 1990 and 2009. So nothing from the 19th century, which is my particular area of study. Nothing from most of the 20th century, literary modernism, all that good stuff, nothing from there. And also interestingly, considering that point about identification, nothing from the immediate past, which you might think those students would be most likely to identify with. 50% of the texts on that list were set in rural areas or about rural populations, which is interesting because some of the discussions have been already about the fact that most of our students are in urban centres. And finally, and this is more encouraging, particularly for Gerardo perhaps, a number of the texts were about migrant experience and written by migrant writers with a migrant background. So what we're going to do, ideally, is get more data, a better survey than the 200 we've done so far, and put that together with resources for teachers to expand the kinds of things that we teach to our children, put together, to make sure that the kinds of narratives include some of these texts I've got up here. Stories by women, stories by Indigenous writers like Melissa Lukashenko, stories by people who've never been allowed to come to Australia, to give the widest possible narrative about Australianness.